The clock on the wall showed 2:15 p.m. as Justice Clarence Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. He had been reviewing case files since early morning in his private chambers at the Supreme Court. The room was quiet, except for the occasional turning of pages and the soft ticking of the antique clock, a gift from his wife on their anniversary. Outside his door, the usual calm of the corridor was suddenly broken by raised voices. Thomas looked up with a frown. He wasn't expecting anyone, and interruptions during his review sessions were rare and unwelcome. "I need to see him now," a woman's voice insisted. "This can't wait." Thomas recognized the voice immediately. Karoline Leavitt, the outspoken press spokesperson who had been making waves with her bold statements about the court's recent decisions. He had seen her on television just last week, confidently fielding questions from reporters with an unwavering stare that made even the most seasoned journalists hesitate. The justice's security detail, two men who had served the court for over a decade, seemed unsure how to handle the situation. One of them knocked tentatively on Thomas's door. "Justice Thomas," the guard said, poking his head in. "Ms. Leavitt is here. She says it's urgent. We tried to reschedule, but she's persistent." Thomas set down his reading glasses and straightened his tie. He disliked surprises, especially when they came in the form of someone who had publicly questioned his judgment on the Westfield case last month. "Give me a minute," he said, gathering the scattered papers into a neat pile. He glanced at his reflection in the window, noting the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes. When the door opened again, Leavitt walked in with the confidence of someone used to commanding rooms. Her blue suit was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair pulled back in a professional bun, but it was the folder clutched tightly in her hand that caught Thomas's attention. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, not rising from his chair. "This is highly irregular. My clerk handles appointments." "I apologize for the interruption, Justice Thomas," she replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But after what I discovered this morning, I couldn't wait for official channels." The room felt suddenly smaller as she approached his desk. Thomas had faced down countless lawyers, politicians, and even presidents, but something in Leavitt's determined walk made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "You have 5 minutes," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Leavitt sat down but perched on the edge of the seat, ready to spring up if needed. "I respect your time, Justice Thomas, so I'll get right to it." She placed the folder on his desk but kept her hand firmly on top of it. "These documents came into my possession through legal channels. They concern your involvement in the Richardson Foundation, while simultaneously hearing cases where the foundation had significant financial interests." Thomas felt a chill run through him, but kept his face carefully neutral. The Richardson Foundation had been his wife's project, not his. At least that's what all public records showed. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "One that could damage your career if made without proper evidence." "It's not an accusation yet," she replied, tapping the folder. "Right now it's just questions. I'm bringing directly to you before taking them elsewhere. I thought you deserved that courtesy." Thomas's eyes narrowed. The implied threat was clear. If he didn't address her concerns, she would go public. His mind raced through the possible contents of the folder. Had someone talked? Had the paper trail he'd carefully hidden somehow surfaced? "You're walking a very thin line," he warned, leaning forward. "The Supreme Court isn't some small-town courthouse where you can barge in making demands." Leavitt didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Justice Thomas, no one is above questioning in a democracy, not even you." The tension in the room thickened as they stared at each other across the polished desk. Thomas felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Fear, perhaps? No, he decided. Not fear. Anger. How dare this young woman threaten everything he'd built? What happened next would change both their lives forever, though neither could have predicted just how quickly. "Would you like some water?" Thomas asked, his voice controlled as he pressed a button on his desk. It was a small power move, reminding her that he controlled even the simplest comforts in this room. "No, thank you," Leavitt replied, her eyes never leaving his face. She'd interviewed enough powerful people to recognize delay tactics. A clock ticked somewhere in the background. Outside the heavy oak door, The world continued its business, unaware of the brewing storm inside these walls. "You mentioned the Richardson Foundation," Thomas finally said, breaking the silence. He folded his hands on the desk, his gold wedding band catching the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. "I fail to see how my wife's charitable work creates any conflict for this court." Leavitt finally opened the folder, spreading 3 documents across his desk. "These are financial disclosures from the past 5 years," she said, "required by law for all justices." She pointed to specific highlighted sections. "And these are records of your investments through Wilson Partners, which you've never disclosed." Thomas didn't touch the papers, but his eyes scanned them quickly. His heartbeat quickened, though his face remained impassive, a skill perfected through decades on the bench. "And this," she continued, placing another document down, "is the ownership structure of the Richardson Foundation. Notice anything interesting?" Thomas saw it immediately. Wilson Partners was listed as the primary funding source for the foundation. His secret investments and his wife's charity were connected through a paper trail he thought impossible to trace. "These appear to be private documents," he said carefully. "May I ask how you obtained them?" "Legally," Leavitt assured him. "A whistleblower at Wilson Partners contacted my office last month. Everything here can be verified through public records, if someone knows where to look." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying the young woman across from him. She was smart, he'd give her that, and thorough, dangerous qualities in someone sitting across from him with evidence that could end his career. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, "you realize the gravity of what you're implying? That a Supreme Court justice deliberately concealed financial connections to cases before the court?" "I do," she nodded, her expression serious, but not triumphant. This wasn't about victory for her. It was about accountability. The Westbrook Energy case last year, the Paulson healthcare decision, the Martinson property rights ruling, all involved companies with direct ties to Wilson Partners. Thomas stood suddenly, walking to the window. The Supreme Court grounds stretched below, tourists taking photos, oblivious to what was happening above. For 30 years, he'd built his reputation as the unwavering voice of judicial restraint. Now it could all collapse because of financial arrangements he'd convinced himself were perfectly separated from his work. "What exactly do you want?" he asked, his back still to her. "I want you to explain these connections," Leavitt said simply. "If there's a reasonable explanation, I'm willing to hear it before taking these documents elsewhere." Thomas turned, his patience finally snapping. "This is nothing but a political hit job," he growled, his voice rising. "You people have been trying to remove me from this court for decades." Leavitt remained seated, unmoved by his outburst. "Justice Thomas, this isn't about politics. It's about upholding the integrity of enough." Thomas slammed his hand on the desk, sending a pen rolling to the floor. "You come into my chambers with stolen documents, making absurd connections and veiled threats." His face had darkened with anger, all pretense of judicial calm abandoned. "These documents weren't stolen," Leavitt corrected him, still maintaining her composure despite his outburst. "And the connections aren't absurd. They're documented facts." Thomas reached for his phone. "Facts? I'll show you facts. You've just committed contempt of court. Do you know what happens to people who threaten justices with fabricated evidence?" Leavitt stood now, gathering her documents with steady hands. "Are you threatening to have me arrested for asking questions about financial disclosures?" "Not threatening," Thomas replied, punching a number into his phone. "Guards," he barked into the receiver. "I need someone in my chambers immediately. We have a situation requiring detention." As he spoke those words, Leavitt's expression changed from determination to disbelief. Neither of them could possibly imagine how quickly both their lives were about to change. The door to Thomas's chambers swung open almost immediately. 2 Supreme Court police officers entered, their faces professionally blank despite the tension filling the room. "Sir?" the taller officer asked, his eyes darting between the justice and Leavitt. Thomas straightened his robes, regaining some of his composure. "This woman has presented falsified documents and made threatening statements against a sitting justice. I want her detained for contempt of court." The officers exchanged quick glances. In their combined 30 years of service, neither had ever received such an order directly from a justice. Usually contempt charges came through proper channels: paperwork, hearings, warnings. "Justice Thomas," Leavitt said, her voice steady despite the shock visible on her face. "You know these documents aren't falsified, and asking questions isn't threatening you." The younger officer stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us while we sort this out." "You can't be serious," Leavitt said, looking between the officers and Thomas. "He's ordering my detention because I asked about financial disclosures. That's not how our system works." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Our system works exactly how the Constitution designed it. The Supreme Court has inherent powers to protect itself from those who would undermine it." He turned to the officers. "Take her to the holding room. I'll prepare the formal contempt order." The taller officer reached for Leavitt's arm, but she stepped back, clutching her folder tightly against her chest. "Before you do this," she said, looking directly at Thomas, "you should know something. I didn't come here without protection." Thomas frowned. "If that's a threat—" "Not a threat," she interrupted. "Just a fact. Everything that's happened in this room for the past 20 minutes has been recorded." A cold feeling spread through Thomas's chest. "That's impossible. Electronic devices are checked at security." Leavitt smiled thinly. "Technology these days is remarkable, isn't it? My team knows exactly where I am and what we're discussing. If I don't check in within the next 5 minutes, everything gets released to every major news outlet." The officers looked to Thomas, uncertainty clear on their faces. The justice's mind raced through scenarios, none of them good. If she was bluffing, he'd be within his rights to have her detained. If not— "She's bluffing," he decided aloud. "Take her to holding. Check her for devices once she's there." The younger officer took her arm, gently but firmly. "Ma'am, please, come with us." Leavitt didn't resist, but as they led her toward the door, she looked back at Thomas. "You're making a grave mistake, Justice Thomas," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected note of what almost sounded like pity. "The truth doesn't fear investigation." Something in her confidence made Thomas's stomach tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. "Get her out of here," he ordered. The door closed behind them, leaving Thomas alone. The silence felt heavier now. He sat down heavily in his chair, noticing that his hands were trembling slightly. With deliberate focus, he reached for his pen and a legal pad, intending to draft the formal contempt order. The pen hovered over the yellow paper. In 30 years on the bench, he had never personally ordered someone detained. There were procedures, processes. Had he overstepped? No, he decided. The court had inherent contempt powers. What he'd done was unusual but not unprecedented. Thomas glanced at his watch. 3 minutes had passed since Leavitt had been taken away. Her 5-minute deadline was probably a bluff, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He reached for his phone, about to call his clerk for advice when he noticed something on the floor beneath his desk. A small black object no bigger than a button. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. A microphone. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. She hadn't been bluffing. 2 more minutes until her deadline. The ticking of the antique clock suddenly seemed deafening as Justice Thomas realized he might have just made the biggest mistake of his career. 9 minutes. That's how long it took for Justice Thomas's world to begin crumbling. His clerk, a brilliant young law school graduate named Peter, burst through the door without knocking, something he'd never done before in 3 years of service. "Justice Thomas," Peter gasped, clutching a tablet in his hand. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, tie askew, as if he'd run the length of the building. "Sir, you need to see this." Thomas looked up from his desk where he'd been staring at the tiny microphone, rolling it between his fingers. "What is it?" he asked, though something in Peter's wild-eyed expression told him he already knew. Peter handed him the tablet without a word. On the screen was a live social media feed. The view count ticker in the corner showed over 3 million viewers, and climbing rapidly. The video showed Thomas's chambers from an angle near the bookshelf. In perfect clarity, it captured his confrontation with Leavitt, his angry outburst and his order to have her detained. Thomas felt the room tilt slightly. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "It started streaming 9 minutes ago," Peter explained, his voice tight with stress. "Every news network is picking it up. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they're all running clips already." Thomas set the tablet down carefully as if it might explode. "She said she was recording, but I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. It didn't matter what he'd thought. "Sir, that's not all." Peter pulled out his phone. "I've been getting calls from reporters asking about these." He opened an email and handed the phone to Thomas. The justice scrolled through photographs of documents, the same ones Leavitt had shown him, but now they were everywhere. Financial statements from Wilson Partners showing his investments, records of cases he'd ruled on involving companies connected to those investments, the ownership structure of the Richardson Foundation with all the damning connections highlighted. "Are these real?" Peter asked quietly. The unspoken question hung in the air. "Did you really do this?" Thomas couldn't answer. The evidence was there, in black and white. Conflicts he'd convinced himself were too distant to matter. Financial connections buried under layers of shell companies and trusts. "The Chief Justice is calling an emergency meeting," Peter continued, when Thomas remained silent. "And Ms. Leavitt's lawyer is already filing for her immediate release, claiming unlawful detention and abuse of power." Outside the window, Thomas could hear the growing sounds of commotion. He rose shakily to his feet and looked down at the court steps. In just minutes, a crowd had begun to gather. Someone had brought signs hastily scrawled with "Impeach Thomas" and "No one above the law." How did she do this? Thomas finally spoke, his voice sounding strange even to his own ears. "Security checks everyone for recording devices." Peter cleared, his throat uncomfortably. Apparently she was wearing a specially designed button camera, latest technology, nearly undetectable. "The microphone you found was just a backup and—" He hesitated. "And what?" Thomas demanded. "And she had permission to bring it in," Peter finished. "A journalist's press credential approved yesterday by the court's public information office for a feature piece they're doing on the building. It was all above board." Thomas sank back into his chair. He had underestimated her completely. Leavitt hadn't just stumbled onto those documents. This had been a carefully planned operation. She had come prepared for exactly how he might react, setting a trap he had walked right into. His phone began ringing, then his private line, then Peter's phone. The world was calling, and they all wanted answers he couldn't give. On the tablet, the live stream continued. It had switched to footage of Leavitt being escorted through the court's hallways by the officers. Her expression wasn't angry or frightened. She looked resolute, almost sad. "What do we do now, sir?" Peter asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Thomas stared at the screen, at the face of the woman who had just exposed decades of careful financial maneuvering in less than an hour. The woman he had impulsively ordered, detained in a moment of panic. "Get her released," he said quietly. "Immediately." But as Peter rushed out to make the call, Thomas knew it was already too late. The damage couldn't be undone. 9 minutes was all it had taken to destroy what he had spent a lifetime building. By noon, the crowd outside the Supreme Court had swelled to hundreds. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Inside his chambers, Justice Thomas stood at the window, watching the scene unfold, with a hollow feeling in his chest. His phone had been ringing nonstop until he finally turned it off. Even his private line, reserved for family emergencies, wouldn't stop buzzing. Everyone wanted a statement, an explanation, or his resignation. Peter appeared at the door again, his face pale. "Sir, they've released Ms. Leavitt." Thomas nodded, without turning. "And?" "She's giving a press conference on the steps right now." Thomas could see her from his window, a small figure surrounded by microphones and cameras. Even from this distance he could tell she stood straight-backed, composed, nothing like someone who had just been wrongfully detained. "What's she saying?" Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Peter glanced at his tablet. "She's being measured, actually. Said this isn't about bringing down one justice, but about fixing a broken system. She's calling for new ethics rules for the court, mandatory recusals for financial conflicts, and an independent oversight committee." Thomas turned from the window with a bitter laugh. "She comes in here with hidden cameras, ambushes me, and now wants to lecture about ethics? Sir?" Peter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "The documents are real, aren't they?" The question hung in the air between them. Before Thomas could answer, his private secretary knocked and entered without waiting. "Justice Thomas, the chief. Justice is here. He's insisting on seeing you immediately." Thomas straightened his robes, trying to regain some dignity. He'd faced criticism before, harsh attacks from the press, protesters outside his house, even death threats. But never something like this from inside the very institution he'd spent his life defending. The Chief Justice entered without ceremony, closing the door firmly behind him. His normally friendly face was grim, deeply lined with worry. "Clarence," he said simply, "what have you done?" "It's not what it looks like," Thomas began, but stopped himself. The excuse sounded pathetic even to his own ears. "It looks," the chief said slowly, "like you ordered the detention of a citizen for questioning your financial disclosures. It looks like those questions might have merit, and it looks like you've put this entire institution in jeopardy." Thomas sank into his chair. "She provoked me. Came in with hidden cameras, prepared documents. I don't care if she walked in with the entire press corps." The chief cut him off, his voice rising. "You're a Supreme Court justice. You've written opinions about judicial temperament and restraint for decades. And then you do this?" Outside, the chants from the crowd grew louder. Thomas could make out the words now. Justice for all or not at all? His phone lit up with a text from his wife. "Turn on the TV, now." Peter silently reached for the remote and clicked on the small television in the corner. Every major network showed split screens. Leavitt's press conference on one side, and on the other, legal analysts reviewing the documents she had released. These financial ties may have influenced at least 15 major decisions in the past decade alone, one commentator was saying. The potential impact on precedent is staggering. Thomas felt physically ill as he watched former clerks and colleagues being interviewed. People who had defended him for years were now carefully distancing themselves, using phrases like "deeply troubling" and "if these allegations are true." The Chief Justice watched the coverage for a moment, then turned off the television. "You need to fix this, Clarence, now." "How?" Thomas asked, feeling truly lost for perhaps the first time in his career. "Start by apologizing, publicly and sincerely. Release a statement recusing yourself from every case connected to these investments, and for God's sake get ahead of the ethics investigation that's coming." As the chief turned to leave, he paused at the door. The court has survived scandals before, but never something this immediate. Everyone saw you do it, Clarence. Everyone. Left alone again, Thomas looked back out the window. The crowd had doubled in size. History was being written, and for the first time in his long career he wouldn't be holding the pen. Evening shadows stretched across Thomas's chambers as he sat at his desk, staring at a blank document on his computer screen. The cursor blinked steadily, mocking his inability to find the right words. "How do you apologize for something you still don't fully believe was wrong?" A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Peter or maybe the Chief Justice again. Instead, his wife stood in the doorway. Her face showed the strain of the day. She'd been getting calls too, reporters camped outside their home, neighbors suddenly unavailable for their weekly dinner plans. "I came as soon as I could get through the crowd," she said, closing the door behind her. She set her purse down and looked at him with eyes that had known him for over 30 years. "Tell me what really happened." Thomas pushed away from his desk. "It was a setup," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "She came in with those documents about the foundation, about Wilson Partners. She had cameras hidden on her clothing. His young wife sat down slowly, her expression serious. But was she right, Clarence, about the investments? The question hung between them like a physical thing. Technically, yes, he admitted finally. But every justice has investments. The connections were distant, through subsidiaries and blind trusts, nothing direct. But you didn't disclose them, she said. It wasn't a question. I didn't think I needed to. Even to his own ears, the excuse sounded hollow. His wife reached across the desk and took his hand. You've always been stubborn, too, proud sometimes, but never foolish. What you did today, having that young woman detained, that wasn't you. Thomas pulled his hand away, standing abruptly. What would you have done? She threatened everything we've built. No, his wife said firmly. She asked questions about things you chose to hide. There's a difference. Her words stung because they carried truth. The anger that had sustained him through the day began to crumble, leaving only the cold reality of his situation. The office phone rang. Thomas hesitated, then answered. Justice Thomas, came the voice of the court's communications director. We need your statement within the hour. Every network is waiting. The longer we delay, the worse. This gets. I'll have it ready, Thomas said before hanging up. His wife watched him with concern. What will you say? What choice do I have? Thomas gestured to the window, where camera lights still illuminated the protesters outside. I'll apologize, recuse myself from the cases she identified, and hope this blows over. It won't blow over, she said gently. Not this time. Deep down, he knew she was right. In his 30 years on the bench, he'd weathered controversies before, but nothing like this. Those had been about his opinions, his judicial philosophy. This was about his integrity. The office door opened again. Peter entered with the court's general counsel, a solemn woman who had served the court for 20 years. Justice Thomas, the counsel said without preamble. Ms. Leavitt has been released. Her attorney is drafting a civil rights complaint against you personally and the court as an institution. Thomas nodded numbly. He'd expected that. And, she continued, the Chief Justice has called an emergency conference of all justices tomorrow morning to discuss ethics reforms. The real meaning was clear. They would be discussing him, what to do about him. I need to write my statement, Thomas said, turning back to his computer. I can help with that, the counsel offered. But there's something else. You should know. Ms. Leavitt is giving interviews. She's being surprisingly measured, talking about systemic problems, not attacking you personally. Something about that bothered Thomas more than if she'd been calling for his head. It suggested she saw herself as fighting for something larger than personal vindication. His wife stood up. I'll leave you to work, she said. But Clarence, for once, don't be strategic, just be honest. Left with Peter in the counsel, Thomas began drafting the most difficult opinion of his career, one about himself, his judgment, and the limits of power. As the words slowly formed on the screen, he wondered if anything he could say would be enough to salvage what remained of his legacy. 1 week later, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Supreme Court's main conference room. All 9 justices sat around the polished oak table, faces solemn as they prepared to vote on the new ethics guidelines drafted in record. Justice Thomas sat at his usual place, though nothing felt usual anymore. His public apology had been broadcast on every major network, his words carefully chosen with help from the court's communications team. In a moment of regrettable judgment, I allowed personal feelings to override the judicial temperament I have strived to maintain throughout my career. He had acknowledged the financial connections, recused himself from the relevant cases, and expressed deep regret for ordering Leavitt's detention. The public reaction had been mixed. Some called it too little, too late. Others praised his willingness to admit error. Congressional hearings had already been scheduled to discuss potential reforms to the court's ethics rules. All in favor of adopting the new recusal standards, the Chief Justice said, looking around the table. Thomas raised his hand along with every other justice. Unanimous. And the new financial disclosure requirements? Again, Unanimous. The new rules would require justices to report all investments, regardless of how they were held or managed. Any connection, no matter how distant, would trigger automatic recusal. Then it's decided, the Chief Justice said, nodding with satisfaction. The most substantial ethics reform in the court's history. As the meeting concluded, Thomas gathered his papers slowly. In the past week, he'd aged years. The media storm continued, though its focus had shifted somewhat from him personally to the broader questions of judicial accountability. Outside the conference room, a familiar figure waited. In the hallway. "Ms. Leavitt," Thomas said, stopping short. She looked different in formal business attire, her press credentials hanging around her neck. She'd been invited to cover the court's announcement of its ethics reforms. "Justice Thomas," she replied, with a small nod, neither friendly nor hostile, just professional. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "Your civil rights complaint," Thomas finally said. "I understand you've withdrawn it." "Yes." Leavitt adjusted her notebook. Once the court committed to meaningful reform, personal legal action seemed counterproductive. Thomas studied her face, searching for signs of triumph or smugness. He found none. "You know," he said carefully, "you could have simply published those documents. You didn't need to confront me personally." She met his gaze steadily. "With respect, Justice Thomas, I think I did. Documents can be denied, explained away, buried in legal challenges. What happened in your chambers that day couldn't be ignored or spun by anyone, not even you." Her words stung, but Thomas couldn't deny their truth. "For what it's worth," he said, lowering his voice, "I've been thinking about what you said, about no one being above questioning in a democracy." A hint of surprise crossed Leavitt's face. "I still believe you ambushed me," he continued. "But perhaps we needed the ambush." Before she could respond, Thomas's clerk appeared at his elbow. "Sir, the press conference is starting soon." Thomas nodded. "If you'll excuse me, Ms. Leavitt." As he walked away, she called after him, "Justice Thomas?" He turned. "Will you be writing a separate statement on the reforms? Your perspective would be valuable." The irony wasn't lost on him. A week ago, he'd nearly destroyed his career trying to silence this woman. Now she was offering him a platform. "I'll consider it," he said with the ghost of a smile. 3 months later, the Supreme Court operated under the strictest ethics rules in its history. Justice Thomas remained on the bench, though he had recused himself from a record number of cases while his past decisions were reviewed by a special committee. Karoline Leavitt had become a respected commentator on judicial affairs, her reputation built on that fateful confrontation. She'd written a thoughtful piece about Thomas for a major publication, focusing not on personal attacks but on the institutional blindness that had allowed conflicts of interest to fester. Occasionally, when the justice passed her in the courts hallways, they would exchange brief nods of recognition. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but something perhaps more important, mutual acknowledgement that the system had been broken, and in its breaking, had found a path to repair. "No one is above the law," Thomas had written in his statement on the reforms. Not even those who interpret it. The words had been entirely his own.